So this recording is going to go over the second part of chapter 4, covering connective tissue. One of the difficulties with connective tissue is that it is difficult to classify, in that the different categories of connective tissue look very, very different. So 4 general classes of connective tissue are connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone tissue, and blood. If you think about it, connective blood, for example, and bone are very different types of tissue. Blood is liquid, bone is a solid tissue. So the reason why these very seemingly different kinds of tissues are nonetheless classified in the same category as connective tissue is twofold. And this is what this PowerPoint is trying to show you. The first reason why that is common, the first criteria that's common to all connective tissue is that all connective tissue has the same embryonic origin. Early in development, there are 3 embryonic tissues formed. One of these embryonic tissues is called mesenchyme, and from mesenchyme, all of connective tissues are going to be derived. So that is one of the criteria for classifying a tissue in the connective tissue category, is whether it came from embryonic mesenchyme tissue. The other factor that is common to all connective tissue is that it is composed of 2 parts. It is made of cells right here, and it is also made of substances secreted by these cells. So these substances are what we call the ground substance, or the protein fibers which combine make the matrix of the tissue. So connective tissue, all forms of connective tissue will be found to have 2 components, cells and matrix. As we go through the different types of connective tissue, we're going to point out the cells of the tissue and the composition of the matrix of the tissue. So for lecture and lab, you should be able to describe each of the connective tissues that we're going to cover and identify the most abundant cells in this tissue and the composition of the matrix of the tissue. I'm not so concerned about memorizing the 4 classes of connective tissue and which of the connective tissues studied fall into which of these classes. They will be mentioned, and it is helpful to know, but it's not necessarily going to be a question on a test if, for example, areolar tissue is cartilage, bone tissue, blood, or connective tissue proper. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. This PowerPoint right here is helpful in understanding the classifications of connective tissue. So notice, for example, that all cartilage tissue has the same type of cells. All connective tissue proper, for the most part, may have the same type of cell. Bone tissue will have the same type of cell. Blood will have the same kinds of cells. Okay, so that's basically what that PowerPoint does. As far as function of connective tissue, well, if you have a tissue that is so varied, the functions are going to be varied. So in some instances, connective tissue connects other tissues together. Tendons and ligaments, for example, bind structures. They may support structures or be there for movement. Bones do that. Protection, that's another function of connective tissue. Is storage. Adipose tissue stores fat. Bones store minerals, etc. Insulation and cushion, again, fat tissue transport blood. So the functions of each individual connective tissue will be pointed out. So as a group, all connective tissue comes from mesenchyme. Another general characteristic of connective tissue is that for the most part, it is vascular. There are, however, exceptions. the exceptions are very important. So note that cartilage tissue, even though it is connective, it is not vascular. It is avascular. You need to know the exception. Other than cartilage, other connective tissues will be vascular. Again, connective tissue is made of two components, cell and the matrix. The matrix in turn is made of two components, protein fibers and ground substance. Protein fibers can be of three types, collagen, reticular, and elastic. And we will note the type of most abundant protein fibers found in each of the tissues mentioned. The ground substance is what binds everything together. These are glycoproteins, lipoproteins, and so these are sticky molecules that are going to attract water and bind everything together. So we're not going to pay too much attention to the ground substance. A little side note, as we mentioned these cells, keep in mind that as we have talked about in chapter 1, when you see the root word sites, that means a mature cell, like osteocytes, chondrocytes. Remember that chondro meant cartilage. We also mentioned that in chapter 1. On the other hand, if you see the root word blast on a cell, now we're looking at young cells. So blast means young. So osteoblast will be young cells of bone. Chondroblast will be young cells of cartilage. Fibroblasts are young cells found in some connective tissue. All right, so keep that in mind as we go over connective tissue. All right, again, most connective tissue are going to have an obvious matrix with cells and protein fibers. Protein fibers can be collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. Ground substance consists of sticky large molecules that attract water, like hyaluronic acid. You might have heard of that one. Proteoglycans with things like chondroitin, which you might have heard of also. Adhesive molecules that are going to hold these substances together. And again, we mentioned mesenchyme as the origin of all connective tissue, and that's what mesenchyme looks like. So these are the basics to keep in mind. So we're going to start with what's called connective tissue proper. And this is called connective tissue proper because this is the kind of tissue that connects or binds other tissues together. Connective tissue proper is divided into two categories, loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. And the term loose and dense describes the density of the protein fibers and the structure of the protein fibers that are going to be found in the matrix of the tissue. So again, just to review, as we go through this connective tissue, we're going to point out so this will be connective tissue. Remember, connective tissue is made of cells and matrix. So as we go through the connective tissue, we'll mention the cells of connective tissue. And remember that the matrix is made of protein fibers, which could be collagen, reticular fibers, or elastic fibers. So collagen, I'm just going to put abbreviations, reticular fibers and elastic fibers. And then the other component of the matrix is the ground substance. So as we go through the tissues, we will mention the type of protein fiber found, the type of cell found. In some instances, like blood or bone, we will also, or cartilage for that matter, we will also note the consistency of the ground substance, whether it is liquid or semi-solid or solid. So we're going to start with connective tissue proper, and there are three types of loose connective tissue proper: areolar, adipose, and reticular. We're going to cover all three. There are three types of dense connective tissue, which is also another connective tissue proper: dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. we're not going to cover elastic. So we're going to start with alveolar connective tissue, and this is a very important tissue. We're going to spend a little bit of time on it. One of the reasons why it's so important is because remember that when we cover epithelial tissue, we kept saying over and over again, underneath epithelial tissue, there is always connective tissue. What I didn't mention is the type of connective tissue that is always found underneath epithelial tissue. The answer is alveolar connective tissue. So alveolar connective tissue is the tissue that is always, no exceptions, found under epithelial tissue. So you can look at any epithelial tissue, and underneath, the very first tissue supporting the epithelial tissue above is going to be a thin layer of alveolar connective tissue. Alveolar connective tissue is characterized by having a gel-like matrix. The cells, there's a great variety of cells in alveolar connective tissue. The ones I want you to remember are fibroblasts. So fibroblasts are going to be the cells of alveolar connective tissue that you'll need to remember. The fibers that you're going to see in the matrix of this kind of tissue are going to be all three types of fibers. So we're going to have collagen fibers, which are these thick fibers here. We're going to have reticular fibers, which are going to be the thinner red lines here. And you're also going to have elastic fibers, which are these dark fibers right there. So all three types of fibers are going to be seen in alveolar connective tissue. The function of alveolar connective tissue is a little bit difficult to explain because it's a bit abstract. It's going to cushion organs. It says that it has immune cells, so it's going to have a protective role, etc. What I need you to remember is that the function, in a nutshell, is going to be to support the epithelial tissue above. That really is its job. So there are going to be little capillary blood vessels in alveolar connective tissue that are going to be sending nutrients and oxygen to the epithelial tissue above. So notice this is right here, this layer of cells that are lining the surface of an organ. This is epithelial tissue, which is avascular. So it's going to need the support of the alveolar connective tissue right here to keep it alive. Because this is a layer of connective tissue that is always found underneath epithelial tissue, sometimes it's given the name of lamina propria. So instead of saying, oh, this is the alveolar connective tissue that supports the epithelial tissue, they just say, oh, this is the lamina propria. You should know that lamina propria means alveolar connective tissue supporting epithelial tissue. Again, this is just an economy of words. That's all we're doing here. The location, again, if you read here, it gives you a whole sorts of locations widely distributed under epithelium of the body. So essentially, you can say, okay, it is always found underneath epithelial tissue, or it makes the lamina propria, which is found always underneath epithelial tissue. Okay, so when we go into the integumentary system and we look at the layers of the skin, we're going to be more precise as to the name of the layer that has the alveolar connective tissue on the skin. Just because we have a chapter just for the skin, we're going to note the name of that layer. But we'll get there when we get there. This right here is a PowerPoint that shows you epithelial tissue up here. So this is a surface. Okay. So this layer right here is going to be epithelial tissue. And hopefully you would know by now this is going to be a stratified epithelial tissue because there's nothing else. You can see the little nuclei of cells, one on top of the other. Also notice these fibers right here. That tells you this is keratinized epithelial tissue. The only keratinized epithelial tissue that we studied is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So that's what this layer is. Now, underneath this layer, we are going to find the alveolar connective tissue. So this pink area, red, all of this pink area down here is the areolar connective tissue. Now that this layer of areolar connective tissue goes to about more or less up here, and it's hard to really give you a specifics, but more or less. Notice that as we go deeper down, these pink fibers become thicker. See here how they become so much thicker. This is a different kind of connective tissue. This is not areolar. This right here will be areolar connective tissue. Now, lucky for us, notice that in this PowerPoint, in this picture, you don't really see all 3 different types of fibers or anything like that. So lucky for us, what we do with areolar connective tissue, we take a sample of it and we stain it with the specialist stains that allow us to see the actual fibers and the little cells. So when it comes to the tissue practical, this is what you're going to see for areolar connective tissue. You're going to see a depiction of a micrograph of the tissue is stained so that you can see all 3 types of fibers. Know the tissue looks like this. You should really be able to identify it easily because it is very, very unique in what it looks like, stained properly. So this is not what we're going to give you and say, okay, name this tissue right here. We're not going to do that. We're going to give you, we're going to give you the other PowerPoint, the other picture right here. Okay, that's for the tissues exam. Okay, the integumentary system exam may be a little different, but the tissues exam for areolar connective tissue, this is what you're going to see. All right, just wanted to apply that. So moving on to looking at loose connective tissue proper. Okay, so the first one was areolar. The second is adipose tissue. And you probably know adipose means fat. So this is essentially fat tissue. Here, what you need to know is only the names of the cells. The matrix is confusing, it's barely seen, so we're not going to worry about the matrix. You do need to know the matrix exists. It's there. We just see it very well. Okay. So the important feature that you need to know is the cell. The cells are called adipocytes. You should know that adipose tissue is connective tissue, which tells you there is a matrix, but it's very difficult to see. What you do see, however, are these huge cells that are filled with an adipose, with a lipid vacuole inside. And so this empty space, quote unquote empty, that you see, which is not really an empty space, is actually fat, it's lipid. Because this lipid vacuole is so huge, the nucleus of the cell is pushed to one little side. So you can see that little dot right there. That's the nucleus of the cell, nucleus of the cell, nucleus of the cell. Because the cell is filled with this lipid vacuole. Let's see. The other thing about this tissue is the location. You should name a few, be able to recognize locations where this tissue is found. The abdomen, the buttocks, breasts, around kidneys. The function is protection, insulation, and also a reserve of energy, of fuel. Okay. So this is another depiction of the tissue. It is a fairly easy tissue to recognize. The only problem with the tissue, and I have these pointed out in the lab PowerPoints, is that sometimes students look at this slide right here and they decide that these lines that you see are made by simple squamous epithelial cells. So they think this is alveoli of the lungs and the tissue is simple squamous. Do not go back and forth between these 2 tissues and make sure you can distinguish them. Adipose tissue, the empty spaces that you see are cells. Look for the little dot, which is the nucleus of the cell. Okay, and don't get it confused with simple squamous epithelial tissue. Okay, so the last of the loose connective tissue propers is reticular tissue. Now, one thing you need to remember, reticular is a word that we use a lot in biology. And the reason why is because RET means net. So reticular means net-like, so net. And there are many things in biology that resemble nets. So one of them is this tissue. So this tissue is a network of fibers. The fibers that we find in this tissue are reticular fibers. So that makes it an easy question for tests. What kind of protein fibers do you find in reticular connective tissue? Well, reticular fibers. So those are the reticular fibers. Reticular fibers are actually collagen fibers, but they are thinner than what we call collagen fibers, and they are branched. So as they are branched, they create this network that is going to support and trap cells. So the function of this tissue is to create a net that is going to hold cells. So the tissue is going to be found in organs that has lots and lots and lots of cells. So the organ needs a net to trap these cells, to hold these cells in place. These organs are going to be organs of the lymphatic system. Remember, lymphatic system is also the immune system, and the immune system is made of cells, essentially. So those are cells of the immune system being trapped there in reticular tissue. Another place are the lymph nodes, again, lymphatic system, bone marrow, which is another organ, of another tissue of the lymphatic system, another, I guess you would say, organ that is trapping or is making cells in this case, and the spleen. And the spleen is an organ that moves cells, it filters blood, and as it does so, it holds a whole host of immune system cells. So it is made of reticular connective tissue. So you should know the organs that where the tissue is found. You should know the characteristics of the organ. The cells of the organ, the ones I want you to remember, are lymphocytes. So most of these cells that you see here with the round nucleus are lymphocytes. In some places you might see lymphocytes and macrophages. That is definitely correct. I just need you to remember lymphocytes, however, for our purposes. The fibers in the matrix will be reticular fibers. So let's see. There we go. So description, reticular fibers support lymphocytes. Function, it's support of structures that have lots of cells. Location, bone marrow, spleen, and liver. And in this PowerPoint, again, you can see the dark fibers, reticular fibers, and then the circles that you see all over the place are the nuclei of the lymphocytes. So that takes care of loose connective tissue proper. So irregular connective tissue, adipose connective tissue, and reticular connective tissue are loose connective tissue proper. The dense connective tissue proper, we're going to look at two of them, dense regular and dense irregular. Dense regular, the word regular is describing the configuration of the collagen fibers found in the tissue. So in dense regular connective tissue, the collagen fibers that make up the tissue are all going in the same direction. So they have a regular pattern. All these pink waves that you see are collagen fibers. And notice that there's lots and lots and lots of them. You can think of dense regular connective tissue as a rope. And if you think of a rope, the rope is going to have the fibers all going in the same direction. And these fibers create this very strong binding structure that is good for that. It's for binding things, for resisting pressure in one direction. Okay, so it can apply force in one direction and resist force being applied in one direction. It is a rope. Dense regular connective tissue is the rope of the body. It makes structures like ligaments and tendons, which are the ropes of the body. Ligaments belong to the skeletal system and they bind bone to bone. Tendons are part of the muscular system, binding muscle to bone. So ligaments and tendons are made of dense regular connective tissue. The fibers of the tissue are collagen fibers. The cells of the tissue are called fibroblasts, which is a good name because the cells are making fibers. So these are the little fibroblasts secreting the collagen fibers. There's one right there. What you see as the dark purple line is the nuclei of the cell. So these are going to be fibroblasts. And it is hard to see the entire cell because of the sheer number of collagen fibers that are hiding the cells in between the collagen fibers. Okay. Aponeurosis is a flat tendon, so that's essentially just another kind of tendon. This is actually a very difficult tissue to identify. It looks very much like a smooth muscle. The key is to pay attention to the fibers. And these wave-looking things are going to be the collagen fibers. The lines are the fibroblasts, so the cells. So the cells are kind of completely occluded in many instances by these collagen fibers that are running in one direction all over the tissue. A smooth muscle, on the other hand, is different in that what you see as waves of pink are the entire muscle cell. And you will see an obvious oval nuclei in the middle of a sea of pink. Okay. So go back and forth between those two tanks of tissue. Make sure you don't confuse them. So cells of the tissue will be fibroblasts, and you should know location, where they're found, and function. Dense irregular connective tissue, now the word irregular is going to refer to the irregular pattern that the dense collagen fibers take. So these, in this case, you're going to find the collagen fibers not going in the same direction, but being positioned in different directions. Okay. So these waves of pink are the collagen fibers. The tissue also have elastic fibers, but the sheer number of collagen fibers kind of obscure the elastic fibers. The cells of the tissue are going to be fibroblasts right here. So these little cells that you see with the purple dots all over, the purple dots are the nuclei of the cells. Those are the fibroblasts. This tissue is also designed to withstand tension, but in this case, because the collagen fibers are going in all different directions, it can withstand tension in different directions. It is found making the capsules of joints, like you can see here. It is also found in the skin. Let me see. I'm going to go back to this PowerPoint right here, which is a PowerPoint of the skin. And remember, we said these right here is, let me change these, is keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelial tissue right there. Then we said the tissue below it, about right here, was areolar connective tissue. That's areolar connective tissue. And then notice that the fibers change and become thicker. That right there is dense, irregular connective tissue. This layer of skin right there, better yet, this layer of skin that has connective tissue is called the dermis of the skin. And I'm doing this because in lab, we're going to be covering the skin. So that's the dermis of the skin. And clearly the dermis of the skin is made by two types of connective tissue. On the top, the most superficial one is the areolar connective tissue layer, and below it is the dense irregular connective tissue layer. The dense irregular connective tissue layer is called the reticular dermis, or the reticular layer of the dermis. Again, remember we said the word reticular is used over and over and over again in biology. So you need to make sure that you pay attention to the qualification of the term. We're not talking about reticular connective tissue. We're talking about the reticular dermis, the layer of the dermis of the skin made of dense irregular connective tissue. I understand this is confusing, so you need to be careful and not just get hung up in the word, but also pay attention to the modification of the word, to what's accompanying that word. So in this case, the reticular dermis is referring to this deeper layer of the dermis made of dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay. So now let me go back to the PowerPoint that we were looking at, this one right here. And notice that it says that this tissue is found in the dermis of the skin. That's true. More accurately, is found in the reticular dermis. Okay, so this is going to be helpful for both lecture in the next test and lab in the first lab practical. So we have the description of the tissue, dense collagen fibers arranged in an irregular pattern. Cells are fibroblasts, function the ability to withstand tension in different directions. It is going to be found in the reticular layer of the dermis of the skin, if you want to be nice. The submucosa of the digestive tract is the equivalent of the dermis of the skin in the GI tract. All right, so that takes care of connective tissue proper. So that took care of, what is it? Give me just a second. I just want to make you see what are we doing here. Took care of these right here. So we took care of these. So we had loose connective tissue proper. We had dense connective tissue proper. Loose connective tissue proper, areolar, adipose, so 2A's, and reticular connective tissue. Okay, dense connective tissue proper, we cover dense irregular connective tissue and dense regular connective tissue. All right, so that's what we have covered. We're going to turn our attention now to the next category of connective tissue, cartilage. We're all familiar with cartilage, I think. We all know what it is and more or less where it's found. We know it has something to do with bones. So the first thing we do about cartilage, connective tissue, so cartilage is connective tissue, is that we describe its general characteristics. So first of all, cartilage is connective tissue, which means it's going to have two parts, cells and matrix. The cells of cartilage are always going to be the same, called chondro, which means cartilage, and then sites. So it doesn't matter what type of cartilage we're looking at, the cells are going to be the same, chondrocytes. If the cell is young, we get rid of the suffix site and we put blast. That would be a cell that's young. Young people have a blast. Okay, chondroblast are the young cells. All right, matrix is made of two substances, the ground substance and the protein fibers. Now, protein fibers do change depending on the type of cartilage. So we're going to note the protein fibers found on each of the three types of cartilage. Ground substance is about the same. The ground substance is such that gives the cartilage a semi-solid consistency. All right, so there are three types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Okay, and I'm naming them in order of abundance. Cartilage is the most abundant, fibrocartilage is the second most abundant, elastic cartilage is the least abundant. The cells are going to be chondrocytes. The matrix is a semi-solid matrix, ground substance, where the protein fibers will be found. Now, this is another thing to note right here. Very, very important. This is the only avascular connective tissue. And that has a lot of implications because that means that cartilage is very difficult or impossible to repair because it has no blood vessels to feed it. It's going to rely on moisture seeping through the tissue to keep the little cells alive. So that's what makes cartilage so difficult to deal with once it's damaged, is the fact that it has no blood vessels. Another point is that because the ground substance is semi-solid, now you have this jelly-like material, okay, of the ground substance, and cells are not very good at living in semi-solid spaces. We wouldn't be good at living in semi-solid spaces. I mean, living things need areas, a substance around them that allows them to move and to receive oxygen and to eliminate waste. So a solid environment is very difficult. The cells or the environment has carved out little spaces for the little cells to live in. Those little spaces or lakes are called lacunae. So these are the lacunae that are carved out on the ground, semi-solid ground substance, and the little chondrocytes are going to live inside that little room. Okay, the little chondrocytes. So look out for that. All cartilage, lacunae, which are the lakes, if you will, where the chondrocytes live. So those are going to be the characteristics of cartilage. You're going to see lacunae, you're going to see chondrocytes inside lacunae. You may or may not see the protein fibers, but you should know they're there. So the first cartilage we want to look at is the most abundant cartilage in the body, which is hyaline cartilage. You should know the places where this cartilage is found, especially because cartilage is coming back. There's another chapter where we're going to deal with cartilage yet again. Notice the lacunae. That's pretty obvious. That should really catch your eye early on. Look at all these lacunae and notice that the little chondrocytes are found living inside the lacunae. So that's a little chondrocyte in there living inside the lacunae. There's another one here and another one here, etc. These substance in between the lacunae is the matrix, and within the matrix of hyaline cartilage there are collagen fibers. We don't see them, but they're there. They're arranged in such a way that they're very difficult to see. They create a very smooth surface. This is collagen fibers in there. Okay, so collagen fibers. All right, so the function of the tissue is a cushioning, resists stress and compression, reinforces bones. Location, that's important. So let me show you the locations here. This is the most abundant of all cartilage. It is found at the end of bones, so covering the end of bones right there. And when it's found covering at the end of bones, that structure is called articular cartilage. So articular cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage tissue. It is also found in the ribs. We call that the costal cartilage. So this area of the rib right there is bone. And the grayish area that you see here, that's actually hyaline cartilage. So costal cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage tissue. In the respiratory tract, we have actually quite a few structures that are made of hyaline cartilage. The trachea or windpipe, look at these rings right there. So when you touch your neck, you feel something hard there. That's not bone. That what you're touching are these rings. And if you touch it, you can feel that these are a ring-like structure. This is called the tracheal cartilage, respiratory cartilage, and it is made of hyaline cartilage tissue. The voice box is made of several of these hyaline cartilage tissue. The bridge of the nose, your nose is flexible, the cartilage in your nose, not at the very top of the beginning of the nose, but after the bone. The flexibility of the nose is given by the nose cartilage, which is made of hyaline cartilage tissue. So you should definitely know the places where hyaline cartilage is found. Learn this term right here. It's coming back many, many times. Articular cartilage. Costal cartilage is also important. Okay. So that takes care of hyaline cartilage. We looked at the most abundant cartilage in the body. Let's look at the least abundant cartilage in the body. First thing about this cartilage that catches your eye should be these large structures here, which are going to be the lacunae, and then the little chondrocytes inside the lacunae. The next thing that may catch your eye are these fibers that you can see in the matrix. The fibers are elastic fibers. The structure is called the lacunae. The cells are chondrocytes. The function, because the fibers are elastic fibers, that gives the tissue more flexibility. So you have now a tissue that maintains a shape and at the same time has flexibility. There are two places where this cartilage is found. The ear, right here, is made of elastic cartilage, the external ear, and then another structure called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a little flap, a little tongue right here of elastic cartilage that is found on top of the voice box. So this is the voice box right here. So what happens when we take in air is that air is going to go through the voice box into the windpipe, and from there into the bronchi and the lungs. Food and liquids are going to take the same path, except that they're not going to go into the voice box. Instead, they need to be diverted to the esophagus, which is going to be found behind the voice box. So the esophagus will be behind. So we need something to prevent food and water from taking the wrong channel and going into the respiratory tract. So what happens when we swallow, when we drink water, is that the epiglottis will be closed. So the movement of swallowing closes the epiglottis and seals the entrance into the respiratory tract so that food and water will be diverted into the tube behind, which is the esophagus. So it is actually a very important function for a very little flap made of elastic cartilage. So those are the two places where we find elastic cartilage. You should know that, and you should be able to recognize elastic cartilage. The third type of cartilage is called fibrocartilage. This one again comes back over and over. Fibrocartilage. Okay, so fibro means there's going to be fibers, and you can see the fibers here. These are actually collagen fibers. Okay, the typical stain that is used to view fibrocartilage is a blue stain. So I know that you're going to be told not to look for color, but in some instances, color does help a lot. This is the only blue stain we have. So if you see the blue fibers, you know that you're looking at fibrocartilage. The tissue has the lacunae, just a little bit smaller than in the other cartilages. That one right there is a lacunae, that's another one. And the little red dot that you see in the middle of the lacunae are the chondrocytes. The function, this is it. It is shock absorption. So it has the same kind of function of other cartilage. It resists compression, is tensile, is fairly strong, but it also absorbs shock. And that's due to the sheer number of collagen fibers found in this type of cartilage tissue. The location is very important because there's really only 3 locations that you need to know. The main locations, probably some books may say the only locations where this cartilage is found. First of all, it is found in between vertebrae, creating what are called the intervertebral discs. So it cushions the movement and the shock as we jump around and walk around and run that may take place in between vertebrae. The other place where it's found, now this is the pelvic bone, and notice that the pelvic bones, the pubic bones, come together at the front and are brought together by this little pad right there of fibrocartilage called the pubic symphysis. So the pubic symphysis is the structure, the tissue that makes up the structure is fibrocartilage tissue. The intervertebral discs is the structure, the fabric that makes up the structure is fibrocartilage tissue. The third place where this tissue is found is in these little pillows of cartilage that are found in the knees, between the femur and the tibia. This is the knee joint right here. Sitting on top of the tibia are these 2 little pillows made of fibrocartilage. The pillows are called the meniscus. So we have a lateral and a medial meniscus. This is the lateral meniscus, that's the medial meniscus. And the, or menisci is singular, meniscus is plural. So the meniscus of the knee are the structures made of fibrocartilage tissue. You should know these 3 structures. Okay. All right. Almost finished. We only have 2 more connective tissues to cover. Next connective tissue is bone tissue. This is very, very different type of tissue. It is connective tissue, so it has all the characteristics of connective tissue, meaning it's going to have, so connective tissue has cells and it has matrix. The cells in bone connective tissue are going to be called osteocytes. It's in there somewhere. Okay, so the cells are osteocytes. The young bone cells are going to be called osteoblasts. Okay. The matrix is very, very different in that it has a ground substance. It has protein fibers. But then it has a third component, which is calcium. calcium phosphate minerals. And it is this third component that makes the matrix a solid substance. Okay? So that gives the characteristic of the tissue. This is a solid tissue because of the calcium phosphate crystals found in the matrix, unique to bone. The protein fibers, we kind of overlook them because we are so used to thinking of bone as just being calcified tissue that we forget that there's also collagen fibers. So there are many collagen fibers within osseous tissue, which gives the tissue flexibility. It is vascularized tissue. Again, we don't think of bone as having blood, but it does, which means that when we break a bone, it will bleed. The function, we kind of know that: protection, support, leverage, storage for minerals, etc. Hematopoiesis, meaning blood cell formation. The way the tissue looks is very different. You see these round structures, and the dark lines in the round structure are going to be the cells, the osteocytes. Now, because this is solid tissue, the cells are going to need a lacunae, are going to need little lakes where they're going to live. So the osteocytes are going to be found inside lacunae. Now, the lacunae is not obvious like it is in cartilage, but it is there nonetheless, and you should know that it's there. So there are really 4 tissues that have lacunae: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage, and bone. There are 3 tissues that are avascular: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. All right, so you should know the basics of bone. Bone is going to have its own chapter, hard calcified matrix with collagen fibers. This is something students forget, are the collagen fibers. Cells are osteocytes, and they will be found inside lacunae. So this is one tissue. Another tissue that has lacunae. You can probably remember the function, and obviously the location is an easy one to find. So that brings us to the last of connective tissues, which is blood. Blood is connective tissue, so it's going to have all the components of connective tissue. It's going to have cells, and in this case, the cells are going to be the red blood cells that we see here. These red blobs are red blood cells, so tons of red blood cells. And then there's also going to have white blood cells. So red blood cells and white blood cells. The white blood cells are these larger cells right here and right here. The matrix is a liquid matrix. We're not going to worry about fibers. We're just going to say liquid matrix. You should know the function, which is transport. You should know the location, which is within blood vessels. So that is fairly easy. All right, so that hopefully helps as an overview of connective tissue. We've already covered muscle tissue, and we have already covered adipose tissue. Just really quick, let's see if anything else in the PowerPoint that we left out. We cover membranes, and we cover inflammation. Yeah, we didn't leave anything out. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording for now, and then what I'm going to do is open up another session